He's adorable. We have a cat too, and I'm always related to the cat.
All right. We are going to talk about speech today and language production, and then we will talk about the vestibular system on Thursday, and then next Tuesday have your final exam before the third exam, final sectional exam. All right. Okay, so speech production. Let's see if this will work on here. Okay, so you can see on the screen right now my voice as I'm talking, and so I'll get the people sitting in front. So Daisy and Lexi are going to be my subjects. So we're going to say the same thing, and we're going to look at the differences in the frequency spectrum for my voice versus your voices. Okay, so you have to be real loud because you got your mask on and everything, right? So we're going to say, how now, brown cow? Okay, ready? And I'm going to pause it so that we can see everything once we get it on there. 1, 2, 3. How now, brown cow?
How now, brown cow? How now, brown cow?
All right. So we can see that the frequencies are similar, well, especially for you all, because you're kind of, you're both female, and so there's a difference in the frequency spectrum there. And you're both sitting about the same distance away. So mine is more intense because I was closer to the microphone, right? But you can see similar frequencies, although you can see differences in the harmonics, which is the differences in Lexi's voice versus Daisy's voice in terms of the way in which the sound reverberates throughout their vocal tract, right? All right. Here. So when we speak, air gets forced up through our vocal cords, through the larynx, and it reverberates throughout our sinus, our nasal sinus, as well as our mouth, and that generates those harmonics, those frequencies that are besides the normal fundamental frequencies, right? And our articulators, which are our lips and our teeth and our tongue and the soft palate of the roof of our mouth, all of those things are moving in order to generate, in order to make that sound, in order to make those frequencies correct. And the articulators are particularly important with consonants as opposed to vowels. So vowels tend to be fundamental frequencies with open mouth types of sounds, whereas the consonants tend to be relying on the articulators in order to make those frequencies. So a phoneme is the smallest component, that's what we call the smallest component of speech. And so when we talk about the alphabet, we talk about letters. When we talk about language, we talk about phonemes, which are sounds. So you have things like p or b, which are the first two consonants. And so everybody say p. Now say b. Now pay attention, well, we're going to do that again, but pay attention to what your lips do. What do your lips do? How do you make those sounds? So puh, buh. Right? So one has your lips opening, puh has your lips opening, and buh is more of a closed mouth and then opening down. Right? So there is a fundamental frequency difference. Puh tends to be a higher frequency than buh, which tends to be a lower frequency. But we also have a difference in the way those articulators are moving in order to generate that phoneme. Right? So we can say bit. Everybody say bit?
Bit.
So bit has three phonemes. It. It. So we have three phonemes there. And if we change any one of those phonemes, we fundamentally change the meaning of that word, right? So now if we change the first one from ba to pa, we now have pit. Or if we change the last one from ta to da, right? Ta, da, which is a, instead of having that push of air, we have sort of a deadening sound, right? Then we get bid. Or we can change the middle phoneme. If we change the vowel, right, we can go from bit to bat based on that. And so how are we producing these sounds? We're doing it through changes in both the fundamental frequencies of the vocal tract. We're also doing it through the changes in the articulators, through the way that we restrict the sound coming out for consonants in particular that we talked about. So everybody say da, da, and fa. Da, fa. Right? So da has your tongue starts at the top of your mouth and comes down. Fa starts with your bottom teeth at the top of your lips and then the mouth opening. Right? So fundamental differences in the way the articulators move in order to produce those different consonant sounds. All right. Yes, we've done enough of that. All right. So many things influence the pattern of these tones, and we can have the same phoneme. We can have the same phoneme, and depending on the speed of the speech and depending on the accent of the speech, we can have really different sorts of frequency spectrums, right? So if you say, "What are you doing?" most of us probably don't pronounce it, articulate it as "what are you doing?" which would look like this on the frequency spectrum, but we tend to say, "What are you doing?" right? Which looks very, very different. It's compressed, and we're missing some of the phonemes in there, and yet we're able to hear, we're able to understand that very good. And so speech is very, very resistant to degradation. It's so important, it's very resistant to degradation. And not only that, but the particular phonemes that we are producing change depending on the context, in which we use them. So if we say did or do, that first D, did or do, is the same phoneme, duh, right? But if we say, but depending on if it's did, which has an open mouth vowel phoneme, or do, which has a more of a round mouth, closed mouth phoneme, it changes the duh. So if we were to look at that on our spectrogram, on our frequency spectrum, what we see is with did, it starts low and comes up high, and we have this higher component, and do drops down. So even though it's exactly the same phoneme, the duh is the same, it comes out different based on what the second phoneme is going to be in that word. Yet we hear that as very similar. So speech is very resistant to change. All right, so we talked about where this is happening in the brain, and it's a lateralized function, and so it's happening in the left hemisphere, 90% of people, in that junction of the occipital, parietal, temporal lobe that we call Wernicke's area. And other perceptions of sound are happening in the right hemisphere. In the right hemisphere that are not language. Language is such a specific type of processing that we route those sounds that are associated with language to this particular place in the brain that's very specialized in analyzing and detecting those sounds and then associating those sounds with memories, right? With identifying what is the word and what is the meaning of the word that was just spoken, just said. All right, so tones come in through the primary auditory cortex in the superior temporal gyrus. When that pattern of columns, so remember we have columns there that are being activated by the incoming frequencies from the cochlea, and that place coding that's happening there. And when that pattern of column activation is recognized as speech, then it gets routed from both the left and the right auditory cortex. So remember, we also have the right side that is sending sounds across the corpus callosum to Wernicke's area. To Wernicke's area for recognition and comprehension of speech. And then from there, there's that internal pathway, the arcuate fasciculus, that is passing under the post-central and pre-central gyri, under somatosensory and motor cortex, to Broca's area, which is going to be involved with language production. And so even when you are just listening to language and you're not taking notes, you're not writing, you're not producing language, Broca's area is still functional. It's helping assemble the grammar. It's doing some more complex types of language processing that is helping you comprehend things. So Wernicke's area is really involved with recognizing the patterns in the words and associating meaning with those words with the association cortices, whereas Broca's area is kind of assembling language. And then also responsible for the output. So if you are writing with your right hand, right, then Broca's area on the left side of your premotor cortex is sending that language production then to your right motor cortex. If you're writing with your right hand, then it's going to your left motor cortex and going out to your right hand because it's contralateral. If you're left-handed and you're writing with your left hand, then that's having to go from Broca's area in the left hemisphere over to the right hemisphere in order to get your language production. And people that are left-handed tend to have about a 10% bigger corpus callosum. We think that that is because of the fact that that information is having to be shared between the two hemispheres more frequently than in right-handed individuals. Obviously, when we're talking, we're activating both sides simultaneously, and you can see how complex this is, right? So I'm having to activate my left and my right motor cortex to cause my mouth and the articulators to move in a particular way in order to generate that language production simultaneously with cortices. All right. So Again, this is just showing increased activation in both Wernicke's area and Broca's area when listening to or having a verbal description here. And that's just another stand of that, showing if we have, if we're reading, it's no different than if we are listening to language. So we can have input come in from the primary auditory cortex, or we can recognize letters on a page or on the screen, and reading that language then gets routed from visual cortex into Wernicke's area, and we see identical sorts of activation of those language comprehension and production pathways. All right. Oh, sorry, more on that. So here we have visual coming in, activating in a similar way both Wernicke's area, association cortices for meaning, and then Broca's area, and then your output motor cortex. So as I mentioned, speech is highly resistant to degradation. It's more than just this complex Fourier analysis of frequencies, right? It's not just looking at the frequency spectrum that's coming in, the columns that are activated in the superiotemporal cortex, and somehow discerning from that speech. It involves a ton of heuristics and a ton of top-down influencing, which helps us do language comprehension in a way that if we were a computer trying to just analyze those frequencies would be very difficult to do. So a lot of top-down influences on language. So here's an example of that. Raise your hand when you can read what that says. Got one here, here. Yes, no? Everybody got it? No? What does it say? Right. So even though half of the letters are missing from that sentence, you all are able to identify that because of top-down influences, because it's something that you have seen a lot, and you're able to fill in the blanks. You know that typically if there's two consonants, that the rest of that word is not going to be consonants, it's going to be some vowels, and you're able to fill that in. And as soon as you have one part of the context, as soon as you have Mary had, and then you're like, oh, I know what that is, right? Because that is something that you're familiar with context. How about this? Read this out loud. Everybody read this paragraph. Right? So this is, this is a real mess. Seriously. All the words are jumbled in here, yet you're able to read that fluently, quickly, without a whole lot of effort, right? Because of the fact that the first and the last letters of every word are in the right place, and because once you start reading it, you're able to put context to it and have that top-down influence. So speech is very, very resistant to degradation. In fact, we only need about 20% of speech in order to understand what is being said. And if you think about that, remember we talked about how the auditory system is set up to detect frequencies. It's not really set up to detect localization of where they're coming from. And it's also not really set up to detect language, but we have this highly specialized processing center that is looking for bits and pieces of that. And we can have things like in your lab that you just did, where we have masking stimuli, where we have other sounds that are present in the environment that make it difficult for us to hear what's being said. And so our brain has learned heuristics and context in order, and top-down influences in order to allow us to have correct understanding of speech with very little of the actual input coming in. And in fact, being able to see my mouth move and visually see that plays a huge role in your ability to understand language. And so when we have our masks on, it is more difficult sometimes to understand people, and part of that is that you have to rely solely on your ears and solely on this sort of thing in order to detect that language. All right, so what I want you to do, I'm going to play 3 clips, and one of the words in each of these clips is mask, and I want you to write down what you think that word is. It's very low. Okay, let's try that again.
It was found that the heel was on the orange.
All right, so what is the word with the static over it?
It was found that the heel was on the orange. It was found that the heel was on the axle. It was found that the heel was on the axle. It was found that the heel was on the shoe. It was found that the heel was on the shoe.
All right, so what were the 3 words that were masked there?
Peel, wheel, heel.
Peel, wheel, and heel, right? How did you identify what the word was? The last word of the sentence, right? So everything was the same. It was found that the word was on the, and then the last word was either orange, axle, or shoe, right? So we're constantly holding information, right, in our auditory processing areas in order to allow that top-down influencing to fill in, right? And actually, the word that I said in each of those was meal, right? But I put the static over the phoneme of the meal, of the M, right? And so it masked that, and you were able to then hear what you wanted to hear. And in fact, the first time that you listen to it, you're probably not able to hear the P phoneme and peel, but the second time, because you're expecting it and you know it's there, you actually start to hear that. Right?
It was found that the heel was on the orange. It was found that the heel was on the orange. It was found that the heel was on the axle.
And so by your expectation of knowing what's coming, it fills that in and you actually perceive something that's not there. So we're constantly storing this incomplete information until we get enough context, to have the top-down influence and fill in that information. All right, so everybody, I want you to write down the definition of this.
Euthanasia. 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 Euthanasia.
All right, so what was the definition of that? What was said? Use it in context. It's only fun if you play along. Do I need to play it again?
Euthanasia. Euthanasia.
Kind of like a mercy killing, medically speaking.
Okay. All right. A mercy killing. So if you're, yes.
I was gonna say humane.
Humane treatment of like animals. So your pet is sick and has cancer, it's going to die, and so you euthanize the animal, right? How many people thought that's what we were talking about there? Show of hands, right? Because we're in a science building and I'm a scientist and we're talking about science stuff. But that's not what I was talking about. I was talking about euthanasia, right? So like kids in Taiwan. All right? No? You didn't hear that?
Euthanasia. Euthanasia.
So this is just getting at the idea that without context, right, without top-down influences, our brain has a very difficult time identifying frequencies and coming up, well, okay, what does that mean? And so your Wernicke's area is looking at those frequencies going, okay, euthanasia, well, okay, that sounds like humane treatment, euthanasia, humane treatment of animals, right? And the context maybe of being in a science class or being in a science building makes you think that way, right? If this had been a Chinese class and we were talking about culture in Asia, then maybe you would have had a different slant and maybe you wouldn't have perceived that as the original meaning of those words, right? All right. So this brings us to the McGurk effect. So I'm going to play four phonemes for you, and I want you to write down what those phonemes are. I'm going to ask you what they are. Please don't make me sit here for 2 minutes and wait for you to respond, right? So listen to the phonemes and tell me what they are. Ready?
Ba. 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 Ba.
All right, one more time.
Ba. 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 Ba.
All right, so what's being said?
Ba.
Ba, right? B-A is the phonemes. Everybody heard that? All right. All right, what about in this video?
Ba. 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 Ba.
What did you see there? What did you hear there?
Ba. 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 Ba.
So what were those four phonemes? Ba, ba, da, and da. All right? The same exact thing was said, was played in each one. However, in the video, the mouth is moving in a different way, so that visually you see ba, va, va, and ga, and sometimes you hear da instead of ga. The mouth is moving in this way, but what you're hearing is ba, ba, ba. It's the same as what I played, right? And in fact, this probably is a better illustration of that. And at the end of this, I sort of looped the example a couple of times. And what I want you to do is look between, shift your vision. There's two faces on the screen. They're saying the same thing, but one face is doing different phonemes than your auditory system is hearing. And depending on which face you focus on, you hear a different sound.
For example, listen to Greg speaking.
Bar, 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 bar.
What do you hear? If you heard bar, 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 you'd be right. But how about now?
Bar, 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 bar.
Chances are you heard far, bar, bar this time with an F, except you didn't. In fact, the audio didn't even change between the two videos.
Bar, bar, bar.
Strange as it may seem, what you hear depends on which video you're looking at. Go ahead, take turns watching each video and see how the sound morphs.
Bar, bar, bar.
This is a perfect example of something called the McGurk effect, which shows how our visuals can alter what we believe we're hearing.
All right, so if you focus on the left side, you hear bar.
Bar, bar.
If you focus on the right side,
bar, 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 bar.
so our brain believes what we see more than what we hear. And so this gets at that idea that language, because sounds can be masked and degraded across transmission, right? That if we have a visual cue that doesn't match up with what our ears are actually hearing, we trust what we see. We trust what we see more than we trust what we hear with language comprehension. The fact that on the right side of the screen, he's making an F by going far, by having the top lip touch the teeth and come down, as opposed to bar, which has the lips opening, right? We're used to seeing what lips do for those different phonemes, and so you hear what you see. You hear what you see in that case, right? Which is pretty remarkable, I think. All right, so all of this allows us, right, to correctly hear language, which is such an important stimulus for our survival, for us, in an environment in which the auditory stimuli are often manipulated or degraded. So context cues are very important. We saw the role that context plays in this. Non-auditory cues like visual cues, which is why if you watch a foreign film that has English dubbed over another language, it feels really awkward watching that because the lips, the phonemes that are being produced, don't match up with the sound that you're hearing. Right? Don't match up with the sound that you're hearing. So speech perception is much, much more complicated than simply a pattern analysis of the frequencies that are being recognized by the cochlea. In fact, in some ways, the frequencies recognized by the cochlea don't matter very much if vision is involved. And if you think about vision, vision doesn't get degraded unless I'm wearing a mask and you can't see what my lips are doing, right? But if you could see my lips moving and they do something different than the incoming frequency that you hear, you trust what you see because it's less likely to, because you saw it, right? It wasn't degraded, versus the incoming sound, which could be manipulated. All right, so what happens when these areas of the brain get damaged? We get conditions of aphasia, where we have problems with speech. And so in Wernicke's aphasia, aphasia meaning severe impairment of language, when Wernicke's area is damaged, and both Wernicke and Broca's area are susceptible to stroke damage through the middle cerebral artery that feeds those areas of the brain, we get what's called fluent aphasia. And so people are still able to produce language through Broca's area, which is not damaged, because Wernicke's area and Broca's area are separated by the postcentral gyrus and the precentral gyrus. Because they're in relatively far apart places in the brain, we can have selective damage to either of those areas without the other area being affected. Right? Without the other area being affected. So in Wernicke's aphasia, we get what's called fluent aphasia, and patients can speak and write, but they have a difficult time comprehending language. And this depends on how severe the damage is, right? We can have mild aphasia, or we can have very severe aphasia where people are not able to really comprehend anything. But typically, because we have all these other top-down influences with context and vision and other things coming in to this area, often people have sort of mild or subtle difficulties with language comprehension. So they may say inappropriate words in a sentence, like they'll be talking boy and talk about girl in a sentence, and those things don't fit in that sentence, but they don't hear, right? They're not able to have the feedback to hear that those words were inappropriately inserted into the sentence. We can also have anomia, which is problems comprehending specific types of words. So it may be objects, or it might be people, or it might be places, things like that. We can have very sort of specific comprehension issues with Wernicke's aphasia. Anomia, which is the lack of nouns, inability to recognize objects or nouns. Broca's aphasia is where we now have problems with comprehension. So a big difference between Wernicke's aphasia and Broca's aphasia is that with Wernicke's aphasia, patients often aren't bothered so much by the aphasia because they don't recognize that they're making mistakes. Right? So because it's a comprehension issue, they're often less bothered by their state. Now, it's very troubling for caregivers and for people that are trying to work with these individuals, because it's hard often to get them to understand what you're trying to say, but they're not necessarily bothered as much by it because they don't understand that they don't understand what's being said. That's very different than Broca's aphasia, because in Broca's aphasia, language comprehension is intact, but they have an inability to produce or make language. And so, again, depending on the damage, depending on how big the stroke is or the damage is in Broca's aphasia, it can be as selective as not being able to produce specific types of mainly grammatical components of speech. For instance, like conjunctions, if, and, or but, that sort of thing. Or it can be complete aphasia where they're not able to speak at all. Or maybe they're only able to utter phonemes. And those phonemes aren't able to be put together in terms of language. So the sort of, the original patient that Paul Broca, French neuroscientist, discovered this area with, had a stroke in this area of the premotor cortex, and was only able to say the phoneme tan. That was the only production he could do, was tan. Tan was all he could say. And after he passed away, they did an autopsy and found out that this area of the premotor cortex was severely damaged by a stroke, and And that's how it became Broca's areas, because Paul Broca was the French neuroscientist that did the autopsy and discovered that area. Right? They often, so if you were to take a patient with Broca's aphasia and give them a worksheet and that had sentences that had grammatical errors in the sentences, they could circle them, they could identify them, but they couldn't correct them, right? So they could say, I know this isn't right, but if you say, okay, well, what is the correct thing, they're not able to do the correction. Yes?
So is this like the complex sentences and stuff like that, can it also like slur speech? Like does it do that? Or, because I know someone that had a stroke and they were like fine, they can comprehend, but like his speech is very slurred and it's hard to understand.
Yeah. So,
is that this?
that probably is more motor cortex, where they're having a hard time, it's not a hard time producing the speech, but it's the physical, it's not the mental production, but it's the physical movement of the articulators and all of the complex things that are happening there in terms of the actual speech production, right? So often then with Broca's aphasia, as I mentioned, with Wernicke's aphasia, patients aren't bothered. With Broca's aphasia, it's very frustrating for people because they feel like they're stuck inside their head. And they can understand what's being said, but they can't communicate back to the world. And so there's a high amount of depression associated with Broca's aphasia. There's high rates of suicide associated with this. And it can be very debilitating. Now, in terms of treatment, though, it has one of the better outcomes, which I think is where I am here. We can also have, back up a second, conductive aphasia, where the white matter, the articulate fasciculus, the pathway between Wernicke's area and Broca's area becomes damaged. That has the best prognosis, right? And it obviously depends on the extent of the damage, but that is the best outcome because we simply, the areas of the brain that are doing this complex processing, Wernicke and Broca's area, are still functionally intact. We just have to reconnect them to each other. And so through experience, through rehabilitation, through speech therapy, we can reconnect those areas through other pathways. We can strengthen other less used pathways to reconnect Wernicke and Broca's area in order to allow the best prognosis for that case. With Broca's aphasia, we have a better prognosis than we have with Wernicke's aphasia because in Broca's aphasia, the patients can participate more actively in that rehabilitative process, right? Because they can understand the therapist, they can understand language. It's a matter of relearning how to produce that output. And in fact, one of the more successful therapies that is out there is called melodic intonation, in which case often people with Broca's area are, Broca's aphasia, are not able to speak, but if you ask them to sing a song that's very familiar, like Happy Birthday or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, right? They're able to sing and produce music because that's coming primarily from the right hemisphere that's not damaged. And accessing areas of the temporal lobe for knowing what words belong in that song that's not damaged. And so people are able to harness the power of music and singing in a way that they're able to now sing what they want to say, and they learn how to take the melody out of what they're saying so that they're able to then regain their speech process, primarily using that right hemisphere. Yes, Jim?
Are they able to learn new lyrics and read lyrics and stuff like that?
No, it's not like that. It's more of songs that they already had learned that are stored in non-language areas of the brain that aren't damaged are able to be accessed and used, right? I mean, they can learn new songs, right? But the melodic intonation typically uses very well-rehearsed, innately programmed sorts of songs that are in non-damaged areas in order to then express themselves. With Wernicke's aphasia, because the comprehension area is damaged, depending again on the extent of the damage, can be very difficult for the patient to recover from that. Because they're not able to do the types of rehabilitative things because they can't understand or comprehend what's being asked of them in that case. The flip side of that is that they're often not bothered by that as much on that side. All right. So more about language.
Hey, Vsauce, Michael here. When you call customer service and hear this,
to ensure quality service, your call may be monitored or recorded.
They're not kidding. Over the last year, the Marchex Institute analyzed more than 600,000 recorded phone conversations Americans made with businesses in the United States. Turns out, people from Ohio were the most likely to use curse words, the A word, the F word, and the S word. Washington State residents were the least likely to use bad words.
I should pause that. So he's talking about states that are
be careful, big words.
most likely to use curse words, but then he doesn't mention the states that are most likely to be courteous, which at the top of the list, thank you, South Carolina, North Carolina, for please and thank you on that list. Whoops.
We're the least likely to use bad words. But what makes a word bad? Well, be careful, because etymologically speaking, even the word bad can be considered a bad word. It began in Old English as a derogatory term for an effeminate man. 80% of swear words overheard in public in 1986, 1997, and 2006 were essentially the same. 1/3 of all counts included the top two, the F word and the S word. Slate's Brilliant Lexicon Valley podcast reported that these 10 words make up about 0.7% of the average English speaker's daily vocabulary, which means socially unacceptable words are used almost as often as socially descriptive words. First-person plural pronouns account for about 1% of the words we say every day. When a bad word is bleeped, it is covered with a 1 kilohertz sine wave, which sounds like this: son of a. By the way, the symbols and squiggles that are used to represent a bad word have a name. They're called growlixes. They were named by Mort Walker in his seminal The Lexicon of Kamakana. He names a lot of things, but most of them show stuff. They don't hide stuff. Why the need to hide bad words, especially if we all pretty much know what's being said? Well, there is no one single reason bad words are bad. Stephen Pinker, in his excellent lecture on the topic, delineates 5 types of swearing. First of all, some words are bad on purpose. They are created and or used with the intent to hurt others. He calls this abusive swearing, using words to insult, humiliate, objectify, or marginalize disfavored people. Now, if that disfavored person is God, we're talking about supernatural swearing, which was particularly taboo in Victorian times. It was believed that casually or vaguely referring to God would physically injure God himself, literally. So, at the time, people were forced to come up with euphemisms like zounds and gadzooks, which originally meant God's wounds and God's hooks, referring to the nails driven through the hands of Jesus. Historically, swear words often came from things we were afraid of, things we perceived as dangerous, stronger than us, and mercurial, such as death, disease and infirmity, sex and sexually transmitted diseases, as well as body fluids, germy, gross effluvia. Words for those gross things became gross and bad in and of themselves, uncouth to speak. But not all words for gross things are socially unacceptable, which brings us to Pinker's second type of swearing, emphatic swearing. Emphatic swearing is where the tabooness of bad words becomes quite practical. You wouldn't usually use those words, but when you really want to convey that your current emotions matter more to you than proper social conduct, you can use them. Dysphonism. A euphemism is a kind, acceptable word that allows you to talk about something unpleasant while simultaneously letting everyone know you totally get that it's unpleasant and want to respect that. For instance, if you want to be professional, you wouldn't say sh**, you might say defecate. If, on the other hand, you really want to drive home just how unpleasant the experience was, dysphonisms can help out a lot. It wasn't a bag of canine defecation you found on your front porch, it was a bag of hot dog shit. Both of these words refer to pretty much the same thing, but they have different levels of social acceptability, and that's very helpful. It means word choice allows us to not only refer to things in the real world, but also to how we feel about them. If both of these words had the same level of social acceptance, we might even have to find new, badder words so as not to lose the power language currently has to express emotion, repulsion, disgust. But when it comes to two words referring to the same thing, but with different levels of social acceptance, who decides which one's good and which one's bad? Well, historically, many of the bad words we use today are the result of class differences. In medieval England, the lower class Saxons spoke a Germanic tongue, while the upper class Normans spoke a language related to French and Latin. English, as we know it today, contains many consequences of their differences. The lower class worked with animals, and from them we get animal names. The upper class only ate the animals, which is where the names of the meat come from. Today's swear words are similar. Defecation stems from fancy pants Latin, whereas the less classy is Germanic. There's also idiomatic swearing, where nothing is being emphasized, no dysphonism is meant. Instead, it's an easygoing type of swearing that shows an atmosphere is casual. Bad words can be used, we're all close here. It's okay to swear, we're all cool. Cathartic swearing is a bit different. It gives us lolochesia, the medical term for the relief swearing provides when you're in pain. In the brain, swearing seems to involve different regions than regular language, which may explain why people with aphasia caused by brain damage struggle to comprehend or construct spoken words, but yet are fluent at swearing, or why people with coprolalia control normal language just fine, but involuntarily utter profanity and obscene words. It turns out swearing may be centralized in the limbic system, along with emotions.
Which is not where that's located.
Automatic voices when in pain or threatened to startle or intimidate attackers, or to let others know what's going on. In humans, bad words are great for this purpose. Their tabooness makes them special. People wouldn't use them otherwise, so they are great alarms. Swearing is changing. Some bad words are being used more and more frequently. Of the 7 words George Carlin said you could never say on television, today, every second, 22 of them are sent out on Twitter. So what will swearing look like in the future? It probably won't go away altogether, it's too useful. But the words we don't like will likely change. History has shown that as disease becomes less scary and sex and the supernatural more personal, words related to them become less taboo and more common. whereas words that were common in the past are increasingly unpleasant, perhaps in the future, spurred not by runaway political correctness, but by wider knowledge. Words like schizo, mental, aspie, or even depressed will take the swear stage. Or as John McWhorter ventured, words centered around class and the gap between opportunity and disadvantage will become more taboo. Salt of the earth, trash, chaff, pikey, urban as a pejorative. When McKay Hatch started a no-cussing club at his school, his campaign became the target of so many online jokes and insults for being lame or anti-free speech. On his book, he literally subtitled his own name, "The Most Cyber-Bullied Kid in the World." People care about this stuff. Is it censorship to tell us what we can and cannot say? Or is it a safety seal, ensuring certain dysphamisms don't get worn down to a quotidian bluntness like every other word? Or is the badness of bad words a boundary, a moving boundary of what we reject? Sometimes arbitrary, sometimes irrational, but always moving in the direction of acceptance, moving forward. Crime and inequality have existed ever since they could. But when NWA released a reaction in the form of a song with a bad word in the title, "F*** the Police," the Federal Bureau of Investigations released a statement against the song. It was the only time up until then and since the FBI has ever issued an official statement about a work of art. Bad words have power. If you want to push for change, you'll need something to push. If everything's fine, nothing's cool. So bad words are the precipitate of a larger reaction, the process of us slowly becoming what we want to become. That's some deep shit. And as always, thanks for watching.
So, just to sort of wrap things up on language, language has power, it has meaning, and we saw some examples of how different ways in which language is used matters, and that language can change. And I think we're seeing that particularly now with a lot of our social justice and realization of things that have been wrong in society, where words now are changing and taking on new meanings and some negative connotations in that way. And that's important for us to recognize as individuals and know how we use those words affects how we interact with other people. All right, get out of here a little early today, and we'll do the vestibular system on Thursday.